On the morning that Sarah Weston saw smoke rising from the chimney of the abandoned cottage on Mill Lane, a cottage that had stood empty for 17 years, she knew that Thornbury was about to change in ways that the village had unexperienced in more than a century, and she wasn't sure whether to feel hopeful or afraid. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Thornbury was a small village in the English countryside, the kind of place that existed in the margins of maps and modern consciousness, bypassed by motorways and largely forgotten by the rush of contemporary life. It sat in a valley in the Cotswolds, surrounded by rolling hills and ancient woodlands, connected to the outside world by a single narrow road that wound through countryside that had changed remarkably little in appearance over several centuries. The village itself was old mentioned in the Domesday Book of 1086, with a church that dated to the 12th century and a collection of stone cottages that ranged from the medieval to the Victorian. At its peak, perhaps in the mid-19th century, Thornbury had been home to around 300 people, supported by agriculture and by a small wool mill that had given the village a modest prosperity. But that peak had been a long time ago. Through the 20th century, Thornbury had experienced the same slow decline as thousands of similar rural villages across Britain. Young people left for opportunities in cities. Farms consolidated and required fewer workers. The wool mill closed in the 1960s, its building converted into apartments that mostly stood empty. The village school closed in 1987 when the number of children fell below the threshold needed to keep it open. The post office closed in 2003, the pub in 2011. By 2015, when our story begins, Thornbury's population had dwindled to just 47 people, most of them elderly, living in a village that felt suspended in time, slowly decaying, waiting for something renewal or final abandonment, though no one could say which was more likely. Sarah Weston was 36 years old, one of only a handful of people under 60 still living in Thornbury. She'd grown up in the village, had left for university in Manchester, had worked in London for several years, and had returned 5 years ago when her father had fallen ill and needed care. Her father had since died, but Sarah had stayed, finding that she preferred the quiet rhythms of village life to the frenetic pace of the city, even if it meant professional sacrifice and a certain isolation. She worked remotely for a London-based publishing company, editing manuscripts from her cottage, connected to the wider world through broadband that was frustratingly slow but functional enough for her needs. Her social life was limited. There simply weren't many people her age in Thornbury, and the elderly residents, while kind, didn't really provide the companionship she sometimes craved. But she had her work, her small garden, her long walks through the surrounding countryside, and most days that felt like enough. The cottage on Mill Lane had belonged to the Hartley family until 1998, when old Mrs. Hartley had died and her children, long since moved away, had put the property on the market. It was a lovely cottage, 17th century, built of the honey-colored Cotswold stone that characterized the region, with a thatched roof and a large garden that ran down to the stream that had once powered the village mill. But it had proven impossible to sell. The asking price had started high, reflecting the cottage's undeniable charm and period features. But there were problems. The roof needed extensive repair, the plumbing and electrical systems needed updating, and the location, while beautiful, was remote. The village had no amenities, no shops or services, and the nearest town of any size was 12 miles away on roads that were frequently impassable in winter. The price had dropped repeatedly over the years, and the cottage had stood empty, slowly deteriorating. The thatched roof had developed leaks, the garden had become overgrown, and the building had taken on that particular sadness that empty houses acquire, a sense of abandonment and waste. So when Sarah saw smoke from the chimney on that October morning in 2015, her first thought was that someone had broken in, perhaps squatters or travelers looking for temporary shelter. She felt a mixture of concern squatters could mean trouble, and a strange excitement that something was actually happening in Thornbury, that the long stagnation was being disrupted. She walked down Mill Lane, noting that the gate to the cottage, which had been hanging crooked for years, had been repaired and was now latched properly. The garden, while still somewhat wild, showed signs of recent attention. The pathway had been cleared, and someone had been cutting back the brambles that had taken over the front border. As she approached the front door, it opened and a man emerged. He was perhaps in his early 40s, tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that suggested time spent outdoors. He wore work clothes, old jeans, and a flannel shirt, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence that Sarah associated with people who were comfortable with manual labor. "Hello," he said, his accent placing him as English but not particularly local. "I'm sorry if I startled anyone. I'm Thomas Bennett. I just bought this cottage, completed the purchase yesterday, and I'm staying here while I work on the repairs." Sarah introduced herself, feeling a mixture of relief and curiosity. "I live just up the lane. I saw the smoke and wanted to make sure everything was all right." "We don't get many new people in Thornbury," Thomas smiled. "I gathered that from the estate agent. He seemed quite surprised that anyone wanted to buy here. But I'm a carpenter and general builder, and I've been looking for a project like this, a period property that needs restoration, somewhere quiet where I can work at my own pace." They talked for a few minutes, the kind of polite getting-to-know-you conversation that happens between new neighbors. Thomas explained that he'd been living in Reading, working for a construction company, but had decided he wanted a change, wanted to work for himself on projects he found meaningful rather than building yet another bland housing development. He'd sold his flat in Reading, taken his savings, and bought the Mill Lane cottage for a price that was astonishingly low by southern England standards, but which represented a significant portion of his available funds. "It's a bit of a gamble," Thomas admitted. "If I can restore it properly, it'll be worth considerably more than I paid. But that depends on me doing most of the work myself, and on the restoration going smoothly. And of course, I'll have to live somewhere else eventually and sell it, since I'll have used all my capital buying and fixing it." Sarah found herself warming to him. There was a directness about Thomas, an absence of pretense, that was refreshing. "Well, welcome to Thornbury. I should warn you, it's very quiet here, very quiet. If you're used to reading, it might be an adjustment. Quiet is what I'm looking for," Thomas said. "I've spent the last 15 years in cities and suburbs, always surrounded by noise and people. I want to see what it's like to have space and silence to hear myself think." Over the following weeks, Sarah watched as Thomas threw himself into the work of restoration. He was there every day, starting early and working until dark, systematically addressing the cottage's problems. The roof was his first priority. He brought in a specialist thatcher to repair the worst areas, but he did the preparatory work himself, replacing rotted timbers and ensuring the structure could support the new thatch. Sarah would sometimes walk past and see him on the roof, working with focused intensity, or in the garden repairing the old stone walls that had partially collapsed. And occasionally they would talk, brief conversations about the work or about village history. Sarah found herself looking forward to these encounters, realizing how starved she'd been for conversation with someone roughly her own age. About a month after Thomas's arrival, Sarah invited him to dinner, partly as a welcome to the village gesture, but partly because she genuinely wanted to spend more time talking with him. Thomas accepted, showing up at her cottage with a bottle of wine and what he called builder, flowers, wildflowers he'd picked from the hedgerows around his property. Over dinner, Thomas told Sarah more about his background. He'd grown up in Kent, had learned carpentry from his grandfather, had gone into construction because it paid better than traditional carpentry, but had never quite felt satisfied with the work. He'd been married briefly in his 20s, a relationship that had ended amicably when both parties realized they wanted very different futures. He'd spent his 30s working hard, saving money, and gradually realizing that he wasn't building toward anything meaningful, that he was just accumulating without purpose. The cottage was like a revelation when I saw it, Thomas said. It was exactly what I'd been looking for without knowing I was looking for it. A real challenge, but the kind of challenge where the work itself would be satisfying. A beautiful building that deserved to be saved. And a chance to live differently, to build a life around craft rather than just around income. Sarah shared her own story growing up in Thornbury, leaving for the city, returning to care for her father. I always thought I'd leave again after my father died, she admitted. Go back to London, resume my career, live the life I'd planned. But when the time came, I couldn't quite bring myself to do it. There's something about this place that holds me. Maybe it's just inertia, or maybe it's something more. I don't know. Do you ever regret staying? Thomas asked. Sarah considered. Sometimes I'm lonely, honestly. There aren't many people my age here, and while the older residents are kind, I don't really connect with them socially. And professionally, I'm not advancing the way I would be if I were in London. But there's also something peaceful about being here, something that feels right even when it's difficult. Does that make sense? Completely, Thomas said. That's part of why I came here. I was tired of always striving, always competing, always feeling like I needed to be more successful or make more money or live up to some external standard. I wanted to find out what it would feel like to just be, to work on something because it was worth doing rather than because it would advance my career. They talked late into the evening, and when Thomas finally left to walk the short distance back to his cottage, Sarah felt lighter than she had in months. It was such a small thing, just a dinner conversation with a new friend, but it mattered. It broke the isolation that had been slowly calcifying around her. Winter came to Thornbury, bringing the cold and the early darkness and the occasional snow that made the village even more isolated than usual. Thomas continued working on the cottage, though the pace slowed as the weather made some jobs impossible. He focused on interior work plastering, installing a new kitchen, updating the electrical system, all tasks that could be done regardless of outdoor conditions. Sarah helped where she could, which wasn't much given her lack of practical skills, but she could paint walls and clean up after the messy work, and Thomas seemed grateful for the company as much as for the assistance. They fell into a comfortable pattern. Sarah would come over after finishing her work for the day, would help with whatever needed doing, and they would talk about everything and nothing. The easy conversation of people becoming genuine friends. And gradually some of the other Thornbury residents began to take interest in what Thomas was doing. The cottage's restoration was visible progress in a village where almost nothing changed, and people were curious. Old Mr. Davies, who'd lived in Thornbury his entire 87 years, would stop by to offer advice about traditional building techniques. Mrs. Patterson, who maintained the village's small church graveyard, brought Thomas cuttings from her garden for when he was ready to replant the cottage garden. These small connections, these gestures of welcome and assistance, seemed to create a subtle shift in the village's atmosphere. For years, Thornbury had felt like it was winding down, waiting to die. The arrival of someone new, someone who was investing energy and resources into restoration rather than abandonment, suggested a different possibility. In January 2016, Sarah was in the village shop, a tiny operation run from Mrs. Patterson's front room, offering basic groceries and newspapers when she overheard a conversation that surprised her. Two elderly women were discussing the cottage restoration, and one said, "It's nice to see something improving rather than falling apart. Makes you think maybe the village isn't quite finished yet." The other woman agreed. "I'd started to think we'd be the last generation here, that after we gone, the village would just be abandoned or turned into weekend cottages for London people. But if young people like Thomas are actually moving here, actually investing in the place, maybe there's hope." Sarah found herself thinking about this conversation over the following days. Hope. Such a simple word, but so powerful. The village had been without hope for so long, had accepted decline as inevitable, that even the small possibility of renewal felt significant. Spring came early in 2016, and with it came another surprise. A young couple, James and Rachel Morrison, bought the old schoolhouse that had been on the market for years. They were both in their early 30s, working remotely in tech jobs, and they were looking for exactly what Thornbury offered: space, quiet, affordability, beauty, and the chance to live differently than the standard urban or suburban model. Their arrival, coming so soon after Thomas's, felt like confirmation of something shifting. Where there had been one new arrival, now there were three, and people began to talk about other possibilities. The old pub building, which had been closed for 5 years, was still owned by the brewery that had run it. Several residents began discussing whether it could be purchased and reopened, perhaps as a community-owned establishment rather than a commercial venture. Sarah found herself at the center of these discussions, almost by accident. She was one of the few younger residents with deep roots in the village, and she'd become friends with Thomas and had reached out to welcome James and Rachel. When people wanted to discuss ideas for village renewal, they came to Sarah's cottage, gathering around her kitchen table to debate possibilities. The pub discussion was complicated. Purchasing the building would require capital that the village residents didn't individually have, but several people suggested that they could pool resources, form a cooperative, and buy it collectively. The business model wouldn't be about generating profit, but about providing a community space, a place where residents could gather, where visitors to the area might stop, where the village could have a social center again. Thomas volunteered to assess the building's condition and provide estimates for necessary repairs. James and Rachel, with their tech backgrounds, offered to help with creating a website, an online presence for the village, to attract potential new residents and visitors. Mrs. Patterson suggested that the church might contribute some funds, as the parish had a small endowment that was intended for supporting community initiatives. Through the spring and summer of 2016, these discussions evolved into actual planning. A steering committee was formed to explore the pub purchase and renovation. Thomas completed the restoration of his cottage, which was now genuinely beautiful, a showcase of how period properties could be renovated with sensitivity and skill. And word began to spread through networks of friends and through online articles about rural revival that Thornbury was a village where change was happening, where new beginnings were possible. In August, another young family moved to the village, the Chungs, a British-Chinese couple with 2 young children, who bought one of the converted mill apartments and who immediately began asking about schools and childcare questions that hadn't been relevant in Thornbury for years. The presence of children changed something fundamental in the village atmosphere. For so long, Thornbury had been a place of elderly people waiting out their final years. Now, suddenly, there were children's voices, bicycles in the lanes, a sense of future rather than just past. By autumn 2016, the committee working on the pub had successfully negotiated its purchase from the brewery, had formed a community benefit society to own and operate it, and had raised enough money through a combination of local investment, grants, and a crowdfunding campaign to begin renovation work. Thomas took on the project as his next major job, hiring a few local workers and some of the new residents who were willing to help. By 2019, Thornbury's population had grown to approximately 90 people, nearly double what it had been 4 years earlier. The demographic profile had shifted dramatically. Instead of being primarily elderly, the village now had a mix of ages, including a dozen children under 10. The school had expanded to serve primary-age children, not just preschoolers. The pub was thriving, hosting quiz nights and live music and serving as a genuine community gathering space. The physical landscape of the village had changed as well. The small new housing development had been completed, designed by an architect who specialized in rural vernacular buildings, creating homes that looked like they'd been there for decades while incorporating modern efficiency and accessibility. Several more of the old cottages had been purchased and restored, following Thomas's example. Gardens that had been overgrown were being cultivated again. The church had been re-roofed, funded by a heritage grant and by a surprisingly successful fundraising campaign. Sarah's own life had changed significantly. Her relationship with Thomas had evolved from friendship into something more, and they were now living together in Sarah's cottage, having decided that Thomas's restored cottage should be sold to help fund their next project, the purchase and conversion of an old barn into a workshop where Thomas could teach traditional building skills and where other craftspeople could rent space. This workshop idea had emerged from conversations about how to create more local employment, how to give people reasons to live in Thornbury beyond just the appeal of quiet rural life. If the village could become a center for craft and traditional skills, it might attract not just residents but visitors, creating economic activity that would support the community. The barn conversion was completed in early 2020, just before the COVID-19 pandemic began disrupting normal life. The pandemic, while devastating globally, had some unexpected effects on Thornbury. When cities were locked down and remote work became standard, rural villages with space and outdoor access suddenly became much more attractive. Thornbury received inquiries from dozens of people interested in moving there, fleeing crowded urban areas and seeking the kind of lifestyle the village offered. This created both opportunities and challenges. The village had limited housing, and rapid growth threatened to overwhelm the community's capacity to integrate newcomers effectively. The steering committee that had formed around the pub purchase had evolved into a more formal community council, and they worked to establish criteria for how growth should be managed. They decided on several principles: prioritize families and long-term residents over weekend cottagers or investors, require that any new development meet strict design standards, ensure that growth was gradual enough to allow for community integration, and commit to maintaining the balance between preservation and evolution that had been articulated at that earlier village meeting. Not everyone who wanted to move to Thornbury was able to do so, which was sometimes frustrating for people who felt excluded. But the village was trying to avoid the fate of many rural communities that had been overwhelmed by rapid change, where property prices had skyrocketed beyond local affordability and where the community had become divided between wealthy newcomers and struggling long-term residents. By 2022, Thornbury's population had reached approximately 120 people, still far below its 19th century peak, but representing a remarkable recovery from the low point of 47 in 2015. The village had a functioning primary school, a thriving pub, a community shop, a craft workshop, regular bus service to the nearest town, and reliable broadband that had been installed as part of a government rural connectivity initiative. More importantly, it had a sense of vitality and purpose that had been absent for decades. The village wasn't just surviving. It was actually thriving, becoming a model for how rural communities could reinvent themselves for the 21st century. Sarah had become something of an expert on rural revival, regularly consulted by other communities, trying to replicate Thornbury's success. She'd written a book about the village's transformation, documenting the challenges and strategies and emphasizing that there was no single formula. Each community had to find its own path based on its particular circumstances and assets. But she de-identified some common elements that seemed to matter: having a core group of committed people willing to do the work of organizing and advocating, finding early visible successes that demonstrated change was possible, balancing preservation of character with acceptance of necessary change, creating opportunities for meaningful participation by both long-term residents and newcomers, and maintaining realistic expectations. Rural revival was a long-term process, not a quick fix. Thomas had built a successful business around the workshop, teaching courses in traditional building skills, hosting craftspeople who wanted rural studio space, and taking on select restoration projects. He'd become a voice for craft quality and for the value of traditional skills in an era of mass production and planned obsolescence. Together, Sarah and Thomas had become central figures in Thornbury's renewal, though they were careful not to dominate decision-making or to claim too much credit. The village's transformation had been genuinely collective, involving dozens of people making countless contributions. Sarah and Thomas had been catalysts, perhaps, but the energy and commitment had come from the whole community. On a spring evening in 2023, 8 years after Thomas had first arrived in Thornbury, the village held a celebration to mark the anniversary of the pub's reopening. It had become an annual tradition, a moment to reflect on how far they'd come and to consider what still needed to be done. The pub was crowded with residents old and new, with children running between tables and adults engaged in conversations about everything from village governance to the weekend's football results. Sarah stood with Thomas, watching the scene, marveling at how different this was from the quiet, declining village she'd known for most of her life. Emma Lawrence, the teacher who'd established the school, approached them with news. "I just got confirmation from the Education Authority. We have enough students enrolled for next year that we can add a secondary program at least for years 7 and 8. Children won't have to leave the village for school until they're 14. This was significant. One of the challenges of rural living was the difficulty of accessing good education for older children. If Thornbury could offer schooling through age 14, it made the village much more attractive to families and reduced one of the main reasons people left. "That's wonderful," Sarah said. "Another piece falling into place." "It's not all falling into place on its own," Emma pointed out. "It's happening because people are working to make it happen, because there's commitment and investment and effort. But yes, it's wonderful to see it working." Later that evening, after the celebration had wound down and most people had gone home, Sarah and Thomas walked through the village in the soft spring twilight. The lights were on in cottage windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. They could hear the sounds of families settling in for the evening. The village felt alive in a way that it hadn't when Sarah was growing up, when it had felt like it was slowly fading away. "Do you think it's sustainable?" Sarah asked Thomas. "All of this growth and change and energy? Or are we just experiencing a temporary boom that will eventually reverse?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "I think it's sustainable if we're intentional about it, if we keep making the right decisions, if we don't get complacent or allow problems to accumulate. But nothing's guaranteed. External forces could still undermine everything we've built: economic collapse, climate change, policy changes that disadvantage rural areas. We can't control those things, but we can control our response to them," Sarah said. "We can be resilient, adaptive, committed to working together to address whatever challenges arise." "Exactly. And that's what gives me hope. Not that everything will be easy or that we won't face setbacks, but that we've built a community that's capable of facing challenges collectively, that has demonstrated it can solve problems and create positive change." They paused at the bridge over the stream, the same stream that had powered the village mill centuries ago, and looked back at Thornbury. The village was silhouetted against the darkening sky, its stone buildings glowing in the last light, its church spire pointing upward, its scattered lights suggesting the lives being lived within. "When I first came back here after my father died," Sarah said quietly, "I thought of Thornbury as a place of endings, a village that was dying where I'd come to witness and perhaps document its final years. I never imagined it could become a place of beginnings, of renewal, of possibility." "Maybe endings and beginnings aren't as separate as we think," Thomas suggested. "Maybe every genuine new beginning requires the ending of what came before." Thornbury had to end as it was, that dying agricultural village with no future, before it could begin as something new. The people who've come here were not restoring what was. We're creating something different, building on the foundations of the past, but making something new. Sarah nodded. "And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that we can preserve the past unchanged, but that we can honor it while building toward a different future. Not that decline is reversible, but that endings can be transformed into new beginnings if we're willing to do the work." They stood there in the gathering darkness, two people among many who had committed themselves to this place, to this community, to the ongoing work of building a life together in a village that had been reawakened from its long decline. Around them, Thornbury settled into evening, its residents safe in their homes, its children sleeping, its future uncertain, but no longer without hope. The next morning, Sarah woke early and went for a run through the surrounding countryside, a habit she developed over the past few years. The spring morning was cool and clear, and as she ran along the paths and lanes she'd known since childhood, she noticed things she'd been too familiar with to really see before. The hedgerows were thick with new growth, birds were nesting, wildflowers were blooming in the verges. The fields were being farmed again. Several of the new residents had started small agricultural ventures, growing vegetables for local sale or raising heritage breed livestock. The landscape that had been slowly reverting to neglect was being actively managed again, showing the signs of human care and attention. She ran past the old mill, now converted into apartments where young families lived, children's toys visible in the gardens. She ran past the new housing development, where smoke rose from chimneys and cars sat in driveways, evidence of lives being lived. She ran through the village center, past the pub and the shop and the school, all of them closed at this early hour, but carrying the potential energy of the activities that would fill them later in the day. And she felt a surge of affection for this place, for the village that had seemed so limiting when she was young and so moribund when she returned, but which had revealed itself to be capable of transformation, of renewal, of becoming more than anyone had thought possible. When she returned home, Thomas was making breakfast, and they ate together in the cottage's sunny kitchen, discussing their plans for the day. Thomas had a workshop session to teach, and Sarah had writing deadlines to meet. Ordinary lives, ordinary responsibilities, but given meaning and weight by the community context in which they were embedded. The story of Thornbury's reawakening was not a fairy tale of perfect transformation. There were ongoing challenges, tensions between different visions of the village's future, practical problems that didn't have easy solutions. The cost of housing had risen as the village became more desirable, making it harder for people with limited means to move there. Some long-term residents felt marginalized by all the changes, felt that the village they'd known was being lost. There were questions about environmental sustainability, about whether the village's growth was compatible with protecting the surrounding countryside and the biodiversity it supported. These challenges required ongoing attention, negotiation, compromise. The community council met monthly to address them, and the meetings were sometimes contentious, sometimes frustrating, but they were also evidence of a living, engaged community that cared about its future and was willing to work through difficulties collectively. Over the following years, Thornbury continued to evolve. A community energy cooperative was established, installing solar panels on suitable buildings and investigating small-scale hydropower using the stream. A food cooperative formed, connecting local producers with residents and creating a more sustainable local food system. The craft workshop expanded, attracting artisans working in various traditional and contemporary crafts, creating a small creative economy cluster. In 2025, 10 years after Thomas's arrival, the village commissioned a sculpture to be placed in the small green near the church, commemorating its renewal. The sculpture, created by one of the craftspeople who'd settled in Thornbury, was abstract but evocative bronze forms that suggested both growth and connection, roots and branches, past and future, intertwined. At the sculpture's dedication ceremony, Sarah was asked to speak. She talked about the village's journey from decline to renewal, about the people who'd made it possible, about the ongoing work required to sustain what had been built. But she focused most on gratitude for the long term. Residents who kept the village alive during its difficult decades, gratitude for the newcomers who'd brought energy and investment, gratitude for the collective willingness to work together despite differences. Thornberry's reawakening isn't a story of one or two heroic individuals, Sarah said. It's a story of a community making countless small decisions that added up to transformation. It's a story of people choosing to invest in a place rather than abandon it, choosing to work together rather than pursue purely individual interests, choosing hope over resignation. She paused, looking at the assembled crowd, more than 100 people now, representing the diverse community that Thornberry had become. And it's an ongoing story. We haven't arrived at some final destination where all problems are solved and all questions are answered. We're still becoming, still figuring out what kind of village we want to be, still navigating the tensions between preservation and change, tradition and innovation, individual desires and collective needs. That work will never be finished, because communities are living things, always changing, always requiring care and attention. The ceremony concluded with a gathering at the pub, which had expanded in recent years to include a larger dining area and a small brewery producing local beer. The pub had become the physical and social heart of the village, the place where residents gathered, where visitors encountered Thornberry's community spirit, where the ongoing conversation about the village's future was conducted. That evening, as Sarah sat with Thomas and their friends around a long table in the pub, she reflected on how unlikely all of this would have seemed just 10 years ago. The room was full of life families with children, elderly residents, young professionals, craftspeople, farmers, all the diverse people who made up contemporary Thornberry. The conversations were animated, the laughter genuine, the sense of connection real. This was what renewal looked like, Sarah thought. Not some idealized return to a golden past that probably never existed, but the creation of something new that honored the past while addressing present needs and future possibilities. It was messy and complicated and imperfect, but it was real and vital and worth celebrating. Thomas raised his glass in a toast. "To Thornberry," he said simply. "May it continue to thrive." "To Thornberry," everyone echoed, glasses clinking, voices raised in affirmation of their commitment to this place and to each other. The village reawakened. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but genuinely and sustainably demonstrating that even in an age of urbanization and decline of rural communities, renewal was possible when people were willing to work together to invest in place, to balance change and continuity, to build community across differences. Thornberry's story would continue, would face new challenges and opportunities in the years ahead, but it had escaped the trajectory of inevitable decline, had written a new narrative for itself, had shown that villages could find new relevance and vitality in the 21st century. As night deepened over the Cotswolds, as the pub's warm light spilled out into the village lanes, as residents made their way home through the familiar streets, Thornberry settled into another evening, another night of quiet rest before another day of life being lived, community being built, future being created. The village that had seemed finished, that had been waiting for abandonment or final decay, had instead awakened to new life, new possibilities, new beginnings. And those beginnings would continue morning after morning, day after day, as long as people chose to make them so. As long as the commitment to place and community remained strong, as long as hope persisted in the face of challenges. The story of Thornberry's reawakening was a story of hope realized, of potential fulfilled, of a community that refused to accept decline as inevitable, and which created through collective effort a future worth living toward. It was a small story in the scope of history, affecting a small place and a small number of people. But it was a real story, a true story, a story that mattered to those who lived it, and which might offer lessons and inspiration to others facing similar challenges in their own communities. And so the village lived on, reawakened, renewed, ready for whatever the future might bring, grounded in the knowledge that together its people could face challenges and create possibilities that no individual could achieve alone. Thornbury had learned to believe in itself again, and that belief, that hope, that commitment to collective flourishing was the foundation on which everything else was built. In the quiet of the Cotswold night, in the warm glow of cottage windows, in the dreams of sleeping children, in the conversations of adults planning tomorrow, the village continued its ongoing journey, not toward some fixed destination, but toward the constantly unfolding possibilities of life lived together in a place that mattered, a community that cared, a future that was being created one day, one decision, one act of commitment at a time. The village reawakens, and having reawakened, it lives, it grows, it changes, it endures. This is the story of Thornbury, and it is the story of every community that chooses renewal over resignation, that chooses to write new chapters rather than accepting that the story is over. It is a story of new beginnings, and like all genuine beginnings, it opens toward a future that cannot be fully known, but which can be approached with hope, with commitment, and with the knowledge that together anything is possible.